Chapter 15. "You again," said a voice from the heart of the mist, and then Paul opened his eyes onto darkness and knew exactly where he was. This time, though. "When they paged me," the voice was saying, "I thought old Jackie Dow was joshing with me because, well, their sense of humour's pretty basic around here. I thought they're pulling my leg. I checked out the arrivals board only the other day, and young Paul's not due down here again for donkey's years. But here you are." Uncle Ernie went on, his voice tightening like a vice. "In person, profoundly dead and unfashionably bloody early. What the hell do you think you're playing at, you stupid arse? Building up your frequent dire points?" Paul looked up at him. "I got shot," he said. "With an arrow," he added, so that the full extent of the injustice shouldn't be lost on his great uncle. "Ricky Wormtoter shot me, and now I'm dead." "Balls," Uncle Ernie snapped. "I've known young Ricky since he was strangling snakes in his praying. Not the sharpest rapier in the case, but a bloody good shot. He'd never have snuffed you by accident." "It wasn't an accident," Paul mumbled. "He shot you on purpose? Why? What did you do to provoke him?" "Nothing," Paul wailed. "He thought he was saving me, or the world, or something. He knew about the nosebleed, but not that I'd already died once and used it up." "Then why, in God's name, didn't you tell him?" Uncle Ernie exploded. "Of all the—" I tried to," Paul whimpered, "but he wouldn't listen. He just kept saying, 'It's all right, trust me.' And then he killed me." "You clan," Uncle Ernie sighed. "You do realise, for want of a little care and attention on your part, the whole bloody project's fucked up. My life's work, the future of the human race, screwed, all because you couldn't be bothered to pick up a phone or write a memo." Tongueless, he could only synthesise a clicking noise out of vestigial memory and illusion. "And it was going so well too. You'd got the girl. I should have guessed it was that Benny Shumway, but at least he did the right thing when the time came. So maybe it was all for the best. If only you'd pulled your finger out and woken her up the moment you got out of the castle, everything would have been just fine. But no, you can't do a perfectly straightforward little job without buggering it up, and I bet you forgot to burn the chalks." Paul was too upset and angry to speak, but he nodded. That seemed to calm Uncle Ernie down a bit, though not much. He muttered something, and immediately they were standing in front of the bead curtain that served as a door for the safe deposit vault. "Stay there. Don't move. Don't touch anything," Ernie growled as he vanished through the curtain. He walked into it, but the beads didn't move. "That's something," he went on as he came back, holding the insubstantial outline of the chalk box. "They're a bit crumbly. You got them far too hot, but they ought to work." He paused and scowled. "You don't know what these are for, do you?" Paul shook his head. "Bloody hell," Ernie said in disgust. "First you were a waste of space, now you're a waste of interdimensional void. These chalks," he said wearily, "are for writing messages across the gap. You write something here, they can read it back home, where you just came from. Not," he added savagely, "that they're going to be a hell of a lot of use to us, because who are we going to write to? Not Benny Shumway, because we can't trust him. Not Ricky Wormtoter, because if I know Judy, he'll be arriving down here himself any minute. And besides, I'm not 100% sure he can read. You got any suggestions? Because I haven't." Not that Paul cared particularly. For the first time he really and truly felt like he was dead. The affairs of the living seemed remote, distasteful, and faintly ridiculous, like American politics. Soon he knew he'd have to make a tremendous effort to remember anything about his past life, and, when you're dead, even the slightest effort is rather hard to justify. So what if the Fae overwhelmed humanity? Wouldn't make any difference down here, and probably it served them right at that. Not his problem anymore. In fact, he wasn't entirely sure he knew what Uncle Ernie was talking about. "Fine," Ernie snarled. "Go ahead, give up. Dissipate and fade away. See if I care. I mean, what's it to you that now I can never go back? I'm stuck here, just like you are. But so what? It's just 20 years of my life I flushed down the toilet for nothing." Go back," Paul repeated foggily. Oh, right, yes, I forgot. You've got some blood of your own stashed away in your vault thing, haven't you? So that's all right." "No, it bloody isn't," Ernie snapped, "because once the Fae have taken over, the last thing I want to do is show my face topside ever again. You should know by now, there's stuff they can do to you that makes being stranded down here seem like a beach party with cake and coloured balloons. I might as well chuck it away or trade it with Jackie Dow for a virtual Snickers bar. Like it matters. Anyhow, he added sharply, compared with the inevitable extinction of the human species. Though I don't know why I'm worrying about it. I mean, it's not me the entire population of the Earth's going to be pissed off with when they start arriving here by the billion. From some hidden place in the air, he produced a handful of ash and shook it out like a tablecloth. Became a sheet of white paper on which he began to write. But the only one I can think of is Kaz Suslowich, and he's not even human, he's a frigging giant. Still, he owes me enough favours. He might just be inclined to help out. All he's got to do is collect a sleeping female and stick her head under the cold tap or something. He stopped writing and looked up. Where exactly did you stash her? He went on. I was able to follow you as far as a closed file store, but it's shielded in there. Couldn't see. I think Benny called it the weapons locker. Shit. Uncle Ernie winced as though he'd burnt himself, then hurled the chalk into the darkness. And let me guess. Ricky's got one key, you had the other. Oh, that does it. I give up. Nothing can get in there without the key. It's practically the securest place in the universe. He crouched down on the illusion of a floor and curled up in a small, desperate heap. All that effort, all that work, all that aggravation I had to go through in order to get your revolting parents to fall in love. And what do I end up with? You. And you're dead, he added viciously, which means I'm stuck with you for bloody ever. Oh, if it wasn't so totally miserable, I'd burst out laughing. It was at this point that Paul decided he'd had enough. He'd got past horror and despair some time ago. Anger not long after that. Detachment and not caring anymore had been harder to shake off, but even they had worked loose and fallen away in the face of the monumental wave of irritation that was gradually building up inside him. It was time, he resolved, that he took the situation in hand before it got too messy to bear. How was he going to do it? He had no idea, but he knew he'd find a way because he realised in the blinding contraflow on the road to Damascus revelation, I'm not what you say as I am. I'm not stupid. I'm not useless. This isn't my fault. It's not fair, and I'm not standing for it. So there. Uncle, Paul said. Uncle Ernie looked at him as though he'd just found him stuck to the sole of his shoe. What? I think I'd like to get out of here now. Uncle Ernie stared at him and then shook his head. On top of all that, not drivel as well, his expression seemed to say. No, really, Paul said. If I go back, maybe I'll be in time to stop Judy finding where Sophie's hidden. I've got the key, and I'll do whatever it takes to wake her up, and that'll be taken care of, won't it? Ernie just laughed. Whatever you say, son, he muttered wearily. Whatever you say. Do whatever you like. I think I'll just carry on being dead for a bit if that's all the same to you. If you like, Paul replied. Only, how can I find Mr. Dow? Ernie didn't answer. He didn't have to. Mr. Dow was standing in front of the bead curtain, bowing very slightly. Good evening, he said. This is an unexpected pleasure. A small, tight grin crossed Paul's face. Actually, he said, it's a bit of a mix-up. Someone killed me, thinking that I still had that blood from my nosebleed. Really, I shouldn't be here. Mr. Dow sighed softly. Alas, he said. Quite, Paul said. But I was wondering, maybe there's something we can do to, well, put it right. I would be fascinated to hear your suggestions, Mr. Dow said politely, although I have to say, I wouldn't recommend optimism at this time. Paul ignored that. Uncle Ernie's blood, he said. The little bottle he's got in the box in there. I was wondering, he paused to take a deep breath, then realised he couldn't. I was wondering if I could use it instead, only, he went on as Mr. Dow pursed his lips, as though saying that of course you'd need a whole new gearbox. Since Uncle and I are related, well, obviously we are, doesn't that mean that the same blood runs in our veins, or practically the same blood, or quite similar blood, anyhow? Carpenter blood, anyway. I mean, it works with marrow transplants, he added hopefully, as the initial brilliance of the idea began to ebb rapidly like a winter sunset. Only I really do have to get back and save my girlfriend, you see. If it was just me, I wouldn't. Hey, Uncle Ernie had apparently snapped out of his cocoon of despondency. That's my blood you're talking about, you thieving little toad. That's my life. Yes, Uncle, Paul said pleasantly, but like you said just now, it's no good to you anymore, is it? If Judy takes over, which she will if I don't get back there very soon indeed, you wouldn't be able to use it anyway. It'd just go to waste, and you'd be no better off. You do see that, don't you? Yes, but... Uncle Ernie was scowling as if he was trying to crack an invisible walnut using his eyebrows alone. But if you take that, I'll be dead, like really dead. Mr. Dow cleared his throat softly. I should point out, Ernest, that... Shut it, you! No, Paul, listen, I need that blood. I can't stay here. I never meant to stay. You know, it's just something I had to do for the sake of the mission. That's why I made sure I had a way out. Otherwise, I'd never have... Paul was looking at Ernie calmly, with deep and refreshing contempt. No, he said, I don't suppose you would, but things have changed and you've got a choice. Stay dead or stay dead, but help save a few lives in the process. Up to you, he added. No pressure. Ernie looked at Paul and then back at the cold, solemn eyes of Mr. Dow. You're bastards, both of you, he said. He goes and screws everything up, and I'm the one who's got to die because of it. That's just so. Mr. Dow coughed gently. Life was unfair, Ernest, he said. Did you really expect death would be any different? Oh, piss off, Ernie replied. You can't make me do it, either of you. I'm not a hero, it's wrong, it'd be murder. The slightest of sighs passed Mr. Dow's translucent lips. No, he said, merely creative accounting. I should point out, for instance, that your account with the bank has been open for nearly 100 terrestrial years, and in that time you would not appear to have paid any bank charges. What? But that's... In addition to which, Mr. Dow went on, there are administration fees, storage charges, facilitation, and expedition costs, plus interest and penalties. The bank is entirely within its rights to press for settlement of these outstanding items at any time. He raised his closed left hand and then opened the fingers a little. Between them, Paul could see a small glass bottle with a splash of something red at the bottom. Or, he said, the bank might see its way to waiving all outstanding liabilities in recognition of your outstanding courage and self-sacrifice for the sake of your entire species. As acting Assistant Deputy General Manager, I do have that discretion, but not, he added briskly, if you keep whining and swearing at me. Do you understand? The ensuing silence seemed to last forever. Right, Ernie snapped suddenly. Fine, have it your way. It's all a complete waste of time, though. It won't do any good. I mean, look at him. And my fucking useless great-nephew there. Save the world. Him, he couldn't even save bottle tops. Mr. Dow turned away from him and slowly reached out his left hand towards Paul. When he received it, the glass bottle felt burning hot because of the minuscule amount of heat left in the blood, he supposed. Thanks, he said to Mr. Dow. That was... Business, Mr. Dow interrupted. No human race would mean no more dead, and no more living to send money and valuables. The effect on the bank's trade would be catastrophic. Purely business, you see? Paul nodded. Of course, he said. Wish me luck. Mr. Dow's face folded into a look of profound sadness. I am sorry to be the one to tell you this, Mr. Carpenter, but there is no such thing as luck. There are coincidences, and humans naturally seek to find some vestige of a pattern in the random vicissitudes of events, since they cannot face the grim reality that nothing is preordained. There is no plan, no grand design, no... Mr. Dow, Paul interrupted. Wish me luck. Good luck, kiddo, said Mr. Dow, and then he reached over and flicked the stopper out of the little glass bottle. It was getting so that the walk back from the bank to the door leading to the cashier's office was practically routine, an alarming thought in itself. If I do this a few more times, Paul told himself, I'll probably count as a commuter. Interesting thought, with property prices in London the way they were, and all this open, empty space. Paul didn't have to look for the door. He knew where it was, in the same way that you can find your alarm clock in the pitch dark. It was shut, of course, but he'd got that point covered. If his calculations were accurate, bottom of the class in maths, first year primary school to 7th year secondary school inclusive, it was nearly time for the cashier to do the banking. He knew J.W. well enough by now to know that, come what might, murder, treachery, civil war, the obliteration of the entire human species, somebody would be along to pay in the takings and draw tomorrow's cheques, even if Dennis, Tanner or Theo Vansby had to do it. He sat down by the door, shooed away a couple of his great-great-grandparents, drawn by the smell of Carpenter blood, and waited. Time passes differently in the grounds of the bank. A century can slip by in a minute. A second can seem like 1,000 years, even making allowances for that. Paul reckoned that he'd been waiting there rather a long time. The nasty thought occurred to him that whoever was doing the banking today might have done it early, in which case the door wouldn't open again for close on 24 hours, by which time the tiny dribble of blood would be all used up. The chalks, he thought. The chalks Uncle Ernie made me burn, which can write messages across the line. He could go back and borrow them, and write a message on his side of the door, help, or something equally succinct. But what if whoever was doing the banking came through while he was off chalk scrounging? Fine, Paul decided, I'll sit here till 5:30, and then I'll know they've done the banking already, and then I can go back for the chalk. except that after 5:30 there'd be nobody left in the building but goblins, and he was by no means convinced that they'd be either willing or able to open the door. "Excuse me." He didn't look round. "Go away," he said. "Excuse me." "Piss off. I can't spare you any blood. I'm sorry. Goodbye." "Excuse me." Not now, Paul thought. Please, not now. He looked around, and a small, wizened, elderly goblin was standing over him, so odd and little and funny-looking that it wasn't in the least alarming, though you wouldn't want it standing next to the sauce bottle when you were eating a cooked breakfast. "Yes," Paul sighed. "Can I help you?" "Just thought I'd say hello," the goblin replied. "Never seen you before, see? Before my time you were." "Well," Paul said, struggling vaguely. Then the dropping penny landed. "Hold on," he said. "If you've come to see me, and we can talk to each other and all, does that mean we're related?" The goblin didn't appear to have heard him. "I always try and make a point of coming and saying hello every time one of our lot checks in, just to be friendly, you know. First time in a strange place. It's nice to have someone to meet you, I always think." "Excuse me," Paul said warily, "but are you a goblin?" "That's right. Well, nice meeting you. I'd better be getting along now. Hope you're settling all right, and give my best to our Dennis when you see him." Before Paul could stop him, the goblin had vanished. Paul thought about the implications of what it had said just long enough to realise that he really didn't want to know, and then turned his attention back to the problem of not staying dead. He just made up his mind to risk going back for the chalks when a thin knife blade of fire burst through the doorframe. It was so long since he'd seen anything like it that it took him a moment to realise that it was light, the glow of the 100-watt bulb in the cashier's room showing through as the door opened. Paul bounded to his feet like a dog expecting a walk. "Hello," he started to say, and then froze. "Hello yourself," replied Mr. Tanner. "Don't tell me the door slammed and you got stuck." He grinned, and then the grin slid sideways into a scowl. "What are you doing in there anyway?" he said. "You should be in your office, scanning those photos of bauxite deposits. Thought I told you I need them by tomorrow." "Sorry," Paul said. I got sidetracked. Well, actually," he amended, "I died. Ricky, Mr. Wormtoter, he shot me." Mr. Tanner shrugged. "Always was a clumsy prat. Hold on, though. You can't have died. You're alive." Paul smiled feebly. "It's rather a long story, actually. So would it be all right if I just slip past and got out of here while you go to the bank? Then you won't have to rush. I won't outstay my time here, and I can tell you all about it when you get back, if you like." "Forget it," Mr. Tanner said. "As long as those pictures are back on my desk with the bauxite clearly marked by 10 tomorrow morning, I don't really give a damn. Go on, get out." Gratefully, Paul scuttled past him and back into the world. Then something tweaked his mind, like biting on a bad tooth, and he spun round. "Mr. Tanner," he called out, "could you wait a moment, please?" "What?" "It's just—" This was going to sound so ridiculous, Paul thought. I'll never be able to look him in the face again, but it's just, he said. "Are we related?" For the first time since he'd met him, Mr. Tanner seemed to be at a loss for words. "Well," he said, "sort of, very distantly, on my mother's side," he added, as though that somehow made it less awful. "How the hell did you find out?" Paul looked away. I met this dead goblin back in there, and he said he was, well, family. And that started me thinking about a photo I saw in an old album. The guy in the photo, my Uncle Derek, though really he was just a cousin, and he didn't look much like a goblin, but he did have red eyes. And at the time I thought, that's just a flash, turns your eyes red. But I just remembered the picture was taken outdoors. Mr. Tanner scowled. "Still don't see why you thought we were related," he said. "The person in the picture reminded me of someone," Paul mumbled. "I just figured out who." "Oh, I see. My mother." "No, well, sort of you, actually." "Yes, well," Mr. Tanner was fidgeting with the handle of his briefcase. "Just don't make a big deal out of it, all right? In fact, why don't you keep it to yourself and not tell anybody ever? Not under any circumstances, agreed?" Paul nodded. "Sorry to bring it up," he said, "but one last thing. Is that the real reason why your mother keeps saving me from certain death and stuff?" The expression on Mr. Tanner's face would have curdled all the milk in Jersey. "No," he snapped, and walked swiftly away. Paul managed to get as far as the chair behind the desk, Benny's old chair with shorter legs than customary. He flopped into it, jarring his back somewhat, and felt the last dregs of energy seeping out of him. It'd been rather a stressful couple of days, what with dying twice and then finding out he'd been carefully bred like a racehorse or a prize pig, and that part of his genetic heritage was shared with Mr. Tanner and all those horrible red-eyed, beaked-clawed, inhuman things that took over the office as soon as the doors were locked. The last thought was, he realised, rather unworthy of him. One of the few people he reckoned he could trust further than a snail could move in a third of a second was Mr. Tanner's mum, who was all goblin, goblin plus with added goblin. She was also, of course, a distant cousin. Hellfire. Now he had to go and wake up the girl he loved, and in doing so put a fellow sentient life form to death, coldly and methodically, because he had no choice unless he wanted the twilight of his species on his conscience for the rest of his short life. It was, Paul couldn't help thinking, all a bit much, particularly on an empty stomach. He tried to remember when he'd last eaten, or shaved, or had a bath, or changed his underwear. Ugh, he thought. Still, no good sitting around when there was work to be done. Which reminded him, after he'd rescued Sophie, killed Countess Judy, and ensured that there would be a tomorrow for Homo sapiens, he'd have to find time to do those perishing bauxite pictures, or else face Mr. Tanner's wrath first thing in the morning. A hero's work was never done, Paul reflected, and it was only the easy bits that got into the epic poems. Before Paul could reach the door handle, the door burst open and Ricky Wormtorter came in. At least he'd taken the time to change out of his shredded tux and do his hair and shave and trim his fingernails and polish his shoes and splash on about a quart of repulsive smelling aftershave and floss his teeth and probably sign a couple of dozen 8x12 photographs for his fan club's next prize draw. He didn't have the crossbow anymore either. Hello, Paul said. I was hoping to run into you. Then, standing on tiptoe so that he could reach, he punched Ricky in the mouth as hard as he could. Paul hadn't expected Ricky to fall over. In fact, he'd assumed that the punch would skid off or it'd break his knuckles, or Ricky wouldn't even notice. But not a bit of it. Ricky staggered back a couple of paces, put his foot in the waste bin, lost his balance, and went down in a manner that could only be described as arse over tit. It was shameful to say, an incredibly satisfying feeling. Bloody hell, Ricky mumbled, sitting up and rubbing his jaw. What's all that in aid of? Paul looked down at him. Oh, just getting in touch with my inner goblin, he said. Then he added, You bastard! You bloody shot me! In a voice that he didn't recognise, but which had to be his. But I kept telling you, it'll be all right. And obviously it is, or you wouldn't be stood there. No, please, put the chair down. Don't hit me. Paul took a moment to relish the sight. Ricky Wormtorter, Master Dragon Slayer, Champion Vampire Hunter, Lieutenant Colonel, retired, of the Riders of Rohan, huddled in a sprawl on the floor with both arms wrapped around his head. I did that, Paul thought, coddling his barked knuckles tenderly. Nice punch, though I do say so myself. It's all right, he said pleasantly. I feel better now. I was just a bit uptight for a moment, that's all. Ricky looked at him through a grill of fingers. Are you sure? I'm fine, really. I think you've loosened a tooth. Really? And all these years Paul had assumed he couldn't punch a hole in a wet paper bag. I mean, sorry, I expect it'll be all right. You can use magic on it or something. Ricky muttered vaguely about magic not working on teeth, but he got up and looked at Paul warily. You sure you're all right? Whatever it was? Absolutely. I was just a bit knocked about getting killed. Well, killed twice, actually. Only the first time it was suicide, I suppose. So, you killed yourself. Ricky got over his fear, apparently. What in God's name made you do that? Well, I thought a chat with my Uncle Ernie might be in order, but he's dead. And I knew about the nosebleed blood, so... Ricky said something in German. It sounded like admiration for Paul's reckless courage, tempered by profound reservations about his mental health. And did it work? No, not really. Well, I did get some good advice while I was down there, but the plain fact is that Uncle Ernie's a bit of a broken reed. Still, there we are. So, and I went to Countess Judy's place and rescued Sophie, so that's all right. You rescued Sophie? Ricky repeated. Paul nodded. And then Benny Shumway rescued me. I know he was the traitor and all, but he seems to have got over that. Now he's engaged to your sister. He's what? Oops, forget I said that, Paul said quickly. In fact, I may have misunderstood entirely. I wasn't really paying attention. That evil little shit is messing around with... Paul frowned. Oh, don't be such a misery, he said. The words were out of his mouth before he realised he was talking to a partner in the firm, management, the boss. But so what? Hardly likely to matter since he'd just flattened the guy with the right cross. Benny's all right. Like I said, he was... That dirty, lecturer, sneaking short bastard. I'll skin him alive and use his hide as a chamois leather. Him and Monica? Look, Paul couldn't help it. The reproving look and wagging finger were nothing to do with him, and he had no control over them. Benny's a good bloke. He risked his neck over and over again to keep Countess Judy from having me killed, and at least he cares enough about her to want to turn her back. He's a dwarf, for crying out loud. Everybody knows they're only interested in one thing. Paul had heard that, yes, but he was under the impression that it was gold. Oh well. Benny's not like that, he protested. He's sensitive. He's got feelings. I hope he's got plenty of them in his bum, because I'm going to kick him from here to Burkina Faso. He's got feelings, Paul repeated sternly, and it's obvious that he doesn't just go by appearances. Do you think he'd be in love with your sister if he did? Her being a car, I mean. Obviously not. He knows that beauty isn't just paintwork deep. The hell with Benny Shumway, Ricky snapped. I really don't want to think about that right now. Look, do you think we could get back to the job in hand, and I will deal with him later? Paul shrugged. If you're horrible to him, I'll be very upset, he said, and amazingly, Ricky stopped pulling faces and seemed to calm down a little. Fine, he said. Now then, where have you hidden the girl? Paul was about to tell him, but hesitated. How can I be sure you're really who you seem to be? He said. For all I know, you could be a shapeshifter or something. Don't be stupid, Ricky said. I'm me. Look, now where's Sophie? But Paul shook his head. I think it'd be a good idea if we went down to the main boardroom, where you've got a really clever trick table. You know, where you can see a person's true shape reflected in the polish. What do you reckon? A waste of time, Ricky said. And there was something in his tone of voice that made Paul wonder whether his right cross and new forceful personality were quite as impressive as he thought. And how come Ricky'd managed to get changed and tidied up so quickly? We need to get on, Ricky continued, before Judy catches up with us. Paul nodded. True, he said. Talking of which, how did you get away from her just now, when you shot me and I died, I mean? Oh, Judy doesn't scare me, Ricky said, with a slightly shrill laugh. I just turned and walked away, but... Paul let his right hand slip into his jacket pocket. He didn't have any sort of plan of action. If the man he was talking to really wasn't Ricky Wormtoter, he was fairly sure that he was in deep trouble. And of course, he didn't have a weapon or anything useful like that. Only a magic screwdriver and a magic time freezing watch. But maybe the enemy, if that's who it was, didn't know that. What are you doing? Ricky said. Never you mind, Paul replied, grasping the screwdriver handle. But I'm giving you fair warning. Either turn back into who you really are and then get lost, or I'll have to do something about it. You've got it all wrong. I'm Ricky Wormtoter. Really? Great. In that case, let's head on down to the boardroom. You can look at your reflection in the tabletop. You'll really enjoy that. You're starting to get on my nerves, Paul, Ricky said, but Paul took no notice. It's you, isn't it? He said, taking a step forward. Must be, because you know about what was said back there when I got shot, and you and Ricky were the only people in the room with me. For a moment, Ricky seemed to waver and flicker, like a faulty video, and then he turned into Countess Judy. She didn't look the same as she had back in Paul's office, though. Shorter, thinner, and was that a big red bruise on the side of her face? I underestimated you, she said. Instead of being just a minor nuisance, you're a major nuisance. Congratulations on your promotion. Paul didn't move. First of all, I'd like to thank my agent, he said. You don't frighten me any more, you know. I don't. Countess Judy looked puzzled. You sure? Because if I was in your shoes, I'd be very scared. And if I was in your shoes, I'd be limping. You couldn't hurt me then, and you can't hurt me now. Ah, Judy said, and suddenly her face melted into a huge grin. But earlier you had a cold. Now it looks like you're cured. In which case, she added, I'm gonna break your fucking neck. With that, she lunged forward, grabbing at him with her outstretched left hand. Paul weaved sideways. She didn't get a hold of him, but her nails ploughed his cheek, almost, but not quite hard enough to draw blood. Tell me where that stupid girl is, she snarled, and I'll let you go. Last offer, and then you're dead. How do you mean? Earlier I had a cold. You know perfectly well. She grabbed at him again, but he found that keeping out of her way wasn't so hard after all. He just had to watch her and move his feet. But he's gone, hasn't he? You're on your own now. You mean Benny Shumway? Don't play dumb with me, she growled, just a trifle out of breath. I know everything that goes on round here. Remember? Ricky Wormtoter, then. Keep still. Somehow Paul didn't feel inclined to comply. Judy was trying to force him into the corner, but a neat little sideways shuffle solved that. If you don't tell me, I guess I'll just have to tear the joint apart brick by brick. It'd take me about 10 minutes. Fine by me, Paul replied, taking 2 steps back and 1 step left. Mr. Tanner and Professor Vansby and Mr. Susovich might get a bit uptight, mind. Screw them. Now she was definitely out of breath, and her face looked strange, out of focus almost, as though she was being filmed through a smeared lens. Why'd you care anyhow? She dumped you, remember? Threw you out. No, she didn't, Paul said calmly. Would you like to stop and have a rest for a bit? You don't want to go overdoing it at your age. Judy shrieked and lunged at him, and when he sidestepped, her momentum carried her forward straight into the corner of the desk. She yowled as a sharp edge stabbed into her knee. You're getting weak, Paul observed. Maybe she's starting to come round. You know, just dozing rather than the full REM stuff. I'm guessing that drip thing that was stuck in her arm was some kind of sedative, which is beginning to wear off. Am I warm? Suddenly, Judy stopped crouching and staggered back until she was leaning against the filing cabinet. Is this what you want? She said. Does it make you feel good watching me die like this? Yes, you're absolutely right. That skinny little bitch is starting to wake up, and I haven't got enough strength to open a Coke can. Unless I can get to her in the next 5 minutes and put her deep under, I'm dead. She was perfectly still now, like a statue or a painting. Her eyes were huge and round, her hair floated like mist, and her skin was soft and glowing. Do you think I'm so evil that I'd deserve to die, Paul Carpenter? Do I look like someone who's so dangerous that they've got to be put down like a savage animal? Look at me. I'm looking, Paul said, and since you ask, yes. Judy's lips parted, making Paul catch his breath. I'm begging you, she said. Please don't kill me. You can have anything you want. Just ask and it's yours. When we make a promise, we have to keep it. If we break our word, we die. Just say what you want, and I promise you'll have it. 3 wishes? 3 wishes granted to you by the Queen of the Fae herself. Isn't that the best offer you'll ever get? Suddenly, and unbidden, Paul's mind filled with a bewildering profusion of images, a vast, bustling, jostling multimedia 4D Argos catalogue of the synthesis of human desires and aspirations. It occurred to him that with 3 wishes from the greatest power on earth, a good man could change the world, could wipe out hunger, war and disease, could do all the things that humans so desperately need and can't seem to do for themselves. Surely, beyond any question, that was what Sophie would want him to do. Indeed, if he turned away from this miraculous opportunity, how could she possibly love him or bear to be anywhere near him? And if he really loved her, he'd make the sacrifice, because you can't truly love someone and not love the whole world. Paul understood this clearly. It made the best possible sense. It was amazing he had been stupid enough not to realise it from the very start. Anything I want? She nodded eagerly. Anything. And you promise, on your word, on my life. The 3 things I want most in the whole world? Yes. Right, Paul said. 1, I want Sophie to wake up. 2, I want you to piss off to your side of the line and never, ever come back. 3, I'm not sure about. I'm torn between world peace and a roast beef sandwich with extra horseradish. Countess Judy screamed, and before Paul could move, her hands were round his neck, her nails digging into his skin just above the collar of his shirt. Tell me, she rasped in his ear. Where have you got her hidden? I'm going to kill you. Do you understand? She was crushing his throat. He couldn't breathe. Any moment now she'd damage him beyond repair, and he really didn't want to see the expression on Mr. Dow's face. Not a third time. Maybe if he hadn't been there, he could have been brave and noble, hoping for Valhalla or the simple switching off of all the lights. But he'd been there and seen what it was like, and he had no wish to go back. In the closed file store, he whispered. A weapons locker. I don't have the key. Judy let go, and as Paul collapsed to the ground, he knew that he'd made the right choice, because still being alive was too wonderful, and nothing is worth dying for. Who's got it then? Judy said, gasping for air like a fish out of water. Benny? Wormtoller? They've each got keys, Paul muttered, but you haven't got time to find them. It takes 20 minutes minimum to find somebody in this place, and just suppose you did get them in time, you'd have all this performance to go through, threats and pleading and casting spells and shit, and you've got, 2 minutes left? Less, probably, with all the energy you just used up. She tried to kick his head, but her knees gave way and she toppled over, crashing into the side of the desk. The expression on her face was sheer disbelief, and she'd never imagined, in her wildest dreams, that it'd end like this. Paul watched her form the intention to stand up, and then realised that she just didn't have the strength. It's too late, isn't it? He said quietly. We'd never get there in time to put her back to sleep, not even if I carried you and ran. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. There was another way, like Benny thought, and I'd have known about it. I would have tried. But this was all I could think of, and I was taking a huge risk as it was. Fuck you, Judy whispered, and her eyes closed. She was falling asleep. She realised what was happening to her with a spasm of pure terror, because she knew better than anybody what can happen to people who die in their sleep, and just how much her people despised waste. But she couldn't help it. Her eyes were shut, her breathing was gradually getting slow and even, her muscles were relaxing. Sweet dreams, Paul thought. But who was he kidding? And then he sneezed. Hell of a time to sneeze when your mortal enemy is dying in agony in front of you. Disrespectful and inappropriate, and you can't help feeling very foolish. An apology was on its way past Paul's teeth when he realised he hadn't just sneezed. He'd sneezed something. Ooh. A big something. Big and growing bigger every second, sprouting arms and legs and a head, and a distinctly old-fashioned slate grey pinstripe suit, and Oxford brogues, and a tie, and little ground glasses, and a small Arthur Law moustache, and a shiny bald head. And I know who that is. It's old Mr. Wells, the senior partner. And what in God's name is going on? Even Judy seemed to have noticed. Her eyelids fluttered open weakly like poisoned butterflies, and she tried to say something. Mr. Wells, meanwhile, was picking himself up off the ground, dabbing at his face with a large red spotted handkerchief, quite possibly the only one still extant outside a textiles museum, smoothing down the sparse fringe of hair that lingered on the slopes of his head, like a village under the crater of an active volcano. "Good and tight," Mr. Wells muttered, and then he turned to Judy, nodded once, and clicked his fingers. He looked like the man behind the counter in the post office, whose queue you really don't want to be in, because it's very long, and glaciers whiz past it like speedboats. But when he clicked his fingers, the room filled with light, and Judy sat bolt upright, her eyes wide open. "Stay," Mr. Wells commanded, as he reached into Paul's jacket pocket and took out Uncle Ernie's broken watch, which he set and then buckled around Judy's motionless wrist. Then from his own inside pocket he took out a very familiar object, a rolled-up sheet of plastic the size of a large placemat, that grew as he spread it against the wall until it changed into a door. Not the scruffy, cavity hardboard door that Paul had tried to make do with when he used the thing, but a fine Georgian-style panel door with an ornate brass handle and finely carved mouldings. It swung open of its own accord as Mr. Wells lifted his hand, and Judy drifted slowly towards him, her feet not moving, an inch off the carpet. Her face was still and strangely grave, no longer beautiful or scary or anything much. And with a certain degree of shock, Paul realised that it was her own face, what she actually looked like. The door opened wide, and she carried on through it, and if she said anything before it closed behind her, then turned back into a sheet of plastic and fell into the wall on the floor, Paul didn't hear it. "Mr. Carpenter," said old Mr. Wells, "this, I believe, belongs to you." He slid the portable door into the cardboard tube it lived in and held it out. "Come along," he said briskly. "It won't bite, or don't you want it any more?" That, of course, was a very good question. I don't know, Paul said. "I mean, it's not really mine. I just found it in a drawer, actually. I thought it belonged to somebody else, in the office." Mr. Wells raised an eyebrow. "But you kept it anyway," he said. Paul hung his head. "Fortuitously," Mr. Wells went on, "it does, in fact, belong to you. It was your great-uncle's. He lent it to me many years ago, and I am ashamed to say that I lost it." "Easily done," Paul mumbled. "I'm always losing things." "In a game of canasta," Mr. Wells added, "with Mr. Tanner's mother and some of her friends. I suspect the game wasn't entirely honest. At any rate, shortly afterwards I was forcibly transformed into a stapler, as you will recall, and could take no steps to reclaim it or return it to your uncle. That it somehow found its way into your keeping suggests that you were intended to have it, and I see no reason to interfere. Keep it by all means, and next time perhaps you should be careful to whom you lend it." He shook his head. "Dietrich Wormtoter is a very capable young man, quite brilliant in his own way, but in other respects somewhat incapable. Had I been at liberty at the time, I would have advised you not to let him have it. It's caused a great deal of trouble since it fell into the hands of the Fae." "A great deal of trouble. You could put it that, Paul supposed." He nodded, and then he took a deep breath. "Mr. Wells," he said, as politely as he could, "what were you doing up my nose?" Mr. Wells's face twitched. It was almost, but not quite, a smile. "For the last few weeks," he said, "ever since this most regrettable crisis started, I have been, to use the modern expression, undercover. Given the delicacy of my position with regard to the complex web of conflicting loyalties in which I found myself, I thought it would be advisable if I put myself entirely out of reach of all the parties involved, while remaining close to the centre of events. Accordingly," he said, "I disguised myself as a cold. There's ambient weird, everyday weird, stuff you can get used to, like tables that reflect shapeshifters as they really are, rooms that move through 90 degrees each month, toilets that flush directly into the interdimensional void, checks that have Bank of the Dead on them in very small writing just above the sort cord, cars that turn out to be the boss's sister, and goblins that turn out to be the boss's mother, dragons in cash machines, and doors you can fold up and store in a toilet roll tube. And then there's can't have heard that right weird, when 2 pages of the Book of Life have got stuck together and the sugar you just spooned into your tea proves to be salt." "Sorry," Paul said, "as a what?" Mr. Wells frowned a little. "A cold," he repeated. "Rather a good idea, though I say so myself. You've probably noticed that a cold goes round an office. Everybody catches it and passes it on to everybody else. A unique opportunity, in fact, to keep the protagonists in the affair under the keenest scrutiny, unseen, unnoticed, one's presence not even suspected, because the disguise is so commonplace. Somewhat taxing, I will admit. There are over 15 billion germs in the average head cold, Mr. Carpenter, and being all of them at once requires effort and concentration, but worthwhile, I think, in the event." Paul nodded. "No point in saying anything, really." "Well," Mr. Wells was looking at his watch, "by my calculations, Miss Pettingell should be due to wake up in approximately 3 minutes and 17 seconds. We should just make it." Paul followed him out of the office, thinking, 3 minutes to the closed file store, that's cutting it fine even if we run. He needn't have worried. The corridors of St. St. Mariacs clearly knew what was expected of them when the senior partner was in a hurry. They shortened. The number of stairs in each staircase diminished. Paul told himself to deal with it and be grateful, and threw the matter out of his mind. "Excuse me," he asked nevertheless, as they turned a corner where usually there was a fire door, "but what's happened to the Countess de Castelbianco? Is she... Mr. Wells didn't pause or turn, but the back of his head waggled from side to side. "Not at all. By intervening when I did, timing was critical, of course. I was able to save the fundamental essence of who she was, her memories, experience, knowledge, personality. It has been removed forever from this world and can do no further harm, but it will survive. She has gone away to the enchanted Isle of Avalon, where her kind can enjoy a hybrid existence, real but outside our reality, where she will not fade or wither. She will walk forever beside the silver waters, through the silvery mists, and she will also be available to do a certain amount of work for us on a consultancy basis, which will be extremely helpful vis-à-vis looking after our long-established clients in the political and entertainment sectors. It's also worth noting that since she will not be technically dead, the remaining partners won't be obliged to pay out the value of her share of the business to her estate." "I see," Paul said. "So that's all right then." "Indeed," replied Mr. Wells, who obviously wasn't noticing sarcasm today. "A most satisfactory outcome for all involved, considering the desperate nature of the situation. Since the Countess remains technically alive, she cannot be succeeded as monarch of the Fae, nor can she give orders, formulate policy, or direct operations. Had she died, we would have faced a renewed threat in a matter of days. Now, I'm delighted to say, the threat from the dreamfolk has been effectively countered, thanks in no small measure," he added, "to you, and of course to your great-uncle's watch. I assume that was what he had in mind when he arranged for it to come into your possession." Paul bit his lip. "I guess so," he said. "In any case," Mr. Wells said, as the door of the closed file store came into view, "it was in the right place at the right time, whether by accident or design. And that's what matters. The firm will, of course, compensate you financially for the loss of your property." Thanks, but no thanks," Paul said. "It wouldn't feel right, somehow. Besides—" "As you wish. Now, if you'll be kind enough to give me the key." "The key?" Mr. Wells pushed open the door. Probably just Paul's imagination, but he could have sworn that the folders and dog-eared manila envelopes all stood to attention on their shelves as he entered the room.
The key to the weapons locker. Come along now, we don't have much time.
Oh, sorry. Paul reached into his pocket. The key wasn't there. Instead, there was a hole.
Come along, Mr. Wells snapped. The key.
Paul mumbled. I think I've lost it. There's a hole in my pocket, you see, and it must have dropped out somewhere.
Oh.
Mr. Wells's forehead crinkled in annoyance.
No time to look for it, I fear. Never mind, if you'd be good enough to let me have your great-uncle's screwdriver.
Paul handed it to him without a word, glad to be rid of it. A touch from its flat tip, and the screws fell out of the locker door's hinges. A moment later, the door itself clattered on the ground. Sophie didn't appear to have moved at all. Her head still rested on Benny's rolled-up gown, and her eyes were still beneath her lids. She was also deathly pale. Even her lips were white. She doesn't look right to me, Paul said. Not like she's just about to wake up. What if something's gone wrong and she's, stuck like it?
Mr. Wells shook his head. She has just passed out of the shadow, he replied. She has been far away. It will take her a little while to come back.
I still think she looks pretty bad.
Well, she was no war painting to begin with.
Then Sophie stirred. Her eyelids twitched and sorted her mouth. Her head lolled a little way onto her shoulder, and she grunted. It was one of the loveliest sounds that Paul had ever heard, even if it did remind him a little of a warthog eating a turnip, because it was the noise she usually made, just before she woke up. Sophie, he said. Sophie, can you hear me? She snorted softly, but her eyes and mouth were still and set once more. She was slipping back into the shadows, and all Paul could do was watch. Or was it? No, certainly not. He was being even thicker than usual. Of course he'd known exactly what to do in this situation ever since his mum had read to him from my first fairy tale book in his pram. Rather tentatively, and wishing Mr. Wells wasn't standing next to him with his left eyebrow raised, he knelt down beside Sophie and gently, tenderly, kissed her on the lips. "Careful," she mumbled, and hit him in the mouth. At least it proved beyond any faint lingering vestige of a doubt that she was the real Sophie, not some forgery concocted by the Fae out of mist and shadow. The real Sophie, as Paul now remembered as he massaged his cut lip, didn't like being disturbed when she was just waking up. She tended to react with violent, spasmodic, but usually very well-aimed movement. Mostly she tended to catch him in the eye rather than mouth, but there weren't any hard and fast rules.
Miss Pettingale.
Mr. Wells's voice was deep and solemn, like Gandalf reading the shipping forecast.
You must wake up now. The dream has ended. You will not remember any of it. It has been wiped from your mind. Open your eyes now, if you please.
Sophie's eyes flicked open. She blinked a couple of times, then wriggled up onto her left elbow. "Paul," she said accusingly, "what the fuck am I doing lying here surrounded by stupid swords and stuff?" It's... He wanted to tell her it was a long story, but he'd run out of words. "Tell you later," he said. "It's all right, though. Tell you later," he repeated. "But isn't this the..." She frowned. "And what's he doing here? Look, just what exactly is going on here, because..."
"Miss Pettingale," Mr. Wells said, "you are at the office in the closed file store. Several weeks have passed since you fell asleep, during which time you were a prisoner of the Fae. You are safe now and everything is under control." He peeked at his watch again. "I suggest that you and Mr. Carpenter go home now, and under the circumstances," a ghost of a smile flitted across his face, "I think you might as well have tomorrow morning off work. I shall, however, be grateful if you would both report to me in my office at 2 o'clock sharp."
Paul breathed out, something he hadn't done for some little time. Right, he said. "Thanks, we'll be there. And, Mr. Wells, what about Mr. Wormtoter and, Mr. Shumway? And we'll need a new receptionist, won't we? Because that wasn't a real..."
"I shall deal with all of that," Mr. Wells said firmly. "You two run along. It's well after 5:30, and the goblins will be about. So please be careful on your way out."
Paul reached out his hand to help Sophie to her feet. She ignored him. She didn't hold with patronising, gender-stereotypical conventions, and wobbled for a moment before her legs remembered how to cope with her weight. "Is that right, Paul, what he just said?" she asked. "I've been held hostage for weeks, and all we get is one lousy morning off. Didn't I always say this firm is such a..." Paul smiled feebly at Mr. Wells, put his hand behind Sophie's shoulder, and shoved her out through the door.